Hey humans, how's it going? Susan Ruth here. Thanks for listening to another episode of Hey Human Podcast. This is episode 407, and my guest is Dr. Annika Hylmö. Annika is an award-winning Swedish filmmaker, and we discuss her upcoming documentary, The Last Witch, about Elizabeth Johnson Jr., a 22-year-old who was the last person wrongfully convicted of witchcraft during the 1692 Salem Witch Trials. And the film is about the efforts to exonerate her by a Massachusetts teacher, her students, and a state senator. I've seen the trailer. I cannot wait for this movie to come out. My friend Lauren said, I've started working with this really amazing woman, and she's doing this documentary, and it's about this wrongfully accused witch from 1600s, and she never was exonerated, and you've got to see it. So I checked out the trailer, and oh my gosh, this looks like the coolest documentary. So I'm super excited for you to hear this episode. General stuff. I'm on Patreon at Susan Ruthism. Check out heyhumanpodcast.com for links and to learn more about my guests in the show. Check out susanruth.com to learn about me and my other artistic endeavors. Follow Susan Ruthism and Hey Human Podcast on social media. Find my music on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, wherever you get your music. Rate, review, and subscribe to Hey Human Podcast on iTunes, iHeart, Spotify, Stitcher, all the places that you get your podcasts. And thank you for helping to keep this show alive and to send it to your friends and family and all of that. I know there is a bazillion podcasts at this point to listen to, and I really appreciate that you are tuning into this one. Thank you for that. All right. Thank you for listening. Be well, be kind, and be love. Here we go. Hi.
Hello. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you.
Welcome to Hey Human.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here, and huge shout out to Lauren Holiday. She's amazing. She started working with us as an intern, and she's so fantastic that she is becoming our new assistant. So yay!
That's
yay
awesome.
for Lauren.
She's really great. Yeah.
Yeah, she's fantastic, and great people are good people to hold on to. So we're definitely holding on to her. As far as the documentary that she's helping out with, it's an incredible story. I think it's one of those stories that's once in a lifetime in some ways, even though we may have more than one once in a lifetime projects coming our way. But this is definitely one of them. I can't wait to show this documentary to the world.
I think it's going to win a lot of awards and a lot of accolades, and the people are really, it feels to me like one, and we'll get into it. I want to start talking about you first, but it feels to me that The Last Witch is going to be one of those movies where everyone's talking about it and saying, have you seen that movie? Have you seen that movie? Oh, you've got to see that movie. So I think you've got yourself a real winner there.
That's the intent. That's what we hope for. We want to have those conversations, and we'd love to get those awards, obviously, too, once it's out there. But I think even more importantly, starting those conversations and getting people talking to each other again. Have you ever noticed how little people are talking to each other?
Yes.
Really talking.
Yes, I actually do notice that. Yes, indeed. Well, let's get into you. Sure. Talk about where you're from, where'd you grow up, what shaped you as a human.
I have a little bit of an eclectic background compared to some, but not all people. I was born in Sweden. I'm a Swedish citizen, and I am a permanent resident here in the United States these days. But I grew up in Sweden and also lived in a couple of other countries when I was growing up. So that makes me a little bit different compared to many who live in one space all the time. And so I lived very briefly in Switzerland when I was very, very young, so I barely remember that. But I also lived in the Bahamas. I lived in the United Kingdom. I went to school in England, and I lived in Los Angeles for a bit when I was growing up before returning to Sweden. And then eventually came back to the US and got more educated and got more educated and got more educated and ended up landing in Los Angeles, where I now live in Santa Monica.
What made you and your family move around so much? What was the impetus for that?
In our case, it was business. And so as the family moved, we all moved. But it is an experience that really shaped me in many ways, both going to local schools in different countries. And I think especially going to school in England, it was a boarding school where there were people from all around the world. And it taught me a lot about humanity, which I think is very pertinent or germane to this conversation, who we are around the world and the challenges that people face around the world, and how and who we become as human beings as a result, how cultural differences shape us and how major political events shape us. So I learned that at a fairly early age. And that's also really impacted me as a human being and how I relate to other people. So that would be a good one.
I imagine I myself also traveled quite a lot as a small child, different schools and all of that. And I know for me, I imagine this is definitely shaped you into what would become your career. When a child is in that sort of environment and experience, they have to assimilate so quickly and navigate so quickly and read people so well for their own well-being, safety, just to assimilate. I'm sure that created a lens in your brain, a filmmaking lens, if you will, because you had to understand everything going around at once.
Absolutely. And your point is, I mean, it's so true that when you move around a lot as a child, you have to pick up really quickly and you get used to that. I think often people will look at it and they'll go, oh my gosh, how did you manage? Well, you manage by learning some tools along the way that I feel have served me my entire life. So I don't look at this as a bad thing, being able to assess situations quickly, being able to connect with people quickly and figure out what makes them tick quickly. You know, to me, it's a skill that I've carried with me my entire life. And it's been a way to really learn about diversity and how people think differently, how people think the same, and to be able to pick up on that very quickly in a way that I think it really helps me. It serves me. And so that serves my career now. It's always served me in a good way.
Did you have an idea of being a filmmaker when you were young? Did you have a creative family? Were they supportive of those aspirations?
Being a filmmaker came to me later, but I was always very creative and I was supported in my creativity for the most part. I'd say it's something that I started at a very, very early age. I was telling stories, creating stories when I was very young. And there are family stories of me performing when I was very little and charging for it. So apparently I would sing songs and then I'd go, okay, and now I want to get paid for it. It's like, give me a coin. So I don't know where that came from.
That is hilarious to me.
And I was very young. So this is when I was not much more than a toddler. So storytelling has always, always been a part of me. I had my own magazine for a long time between the ages of 8 and 12, I think, and then I started training as a singer, as a classical singer, starting around the age of 12. So stories have always been a part of me. And as far as films and the movies go, some of my earliest impressions of films, they range from Charlie Chaplin movies, because I would sneak away. There was this small theater in the town where I was born and where I lived when I was very young. And I'd sneak into that theater. I must have been 7 at the time, which is crazy, but I snuck into that theater, afternoon matinees, and watched Charlie Chaplin movies. So that became a strong influence for me in many ways. And then the other ones that really stood out for me are the Pippi Longstocking movies that I think I started watching in the cinema when I was about 4 or 5 or something like that. So movies have always been a part of me, even though I didn't start working as a filmmaker until much later in life. But they've always followed me and inspired me.
Is this what you went to college for then? Or when you say later in life, what does that mean exactly?
Well, I went to college for communication. And so I went to school to study communication, first mass media and communication, and then international communication, and then organizational communication, which is my PhD. And there's a thread here. When people ask me what communication is about, it's ultimately about storytelling. So it's about the stories that we tell and we share with each other, and where we find commonality and difference in those, how we interpret it, and so on. But I didn't study movies specifically. That being said, when I was working as an assistant professor at Loyola Marymount, especially, I was studying films. I was studying what I consider to be or call teen queen movies. So where you have a story about a teenage girl who becomes herself. It's a coming of age story. And usually she finds some kind of career during this. And she takes over and in one capacity or another rules the world. So if you look back in time, it would be things like Princess Diaries, which people still watch, right? And it would be The Hunger Games and those types of stories. So I got to know those really well and got a little frustrated with them. And this is what pushed me over into filmmaking more, is because I found that it was too often it was happenstance that girls were thrown into it as opposed to being the drivers of their own journeys. Too often, especially in the comedies, that it was easy to get the career, that it's like you get discovered. You have to go through a journey, but you are discovered. So that was another thing, that it wasn't that you worked hard for a long period of time. There was usually something else that you had to work on, but your innate talent just showed up. And all of a sudden you could do things. So that would be a second thing. And then the third thing that drove me crazy was that the mothers were dead or they were really flighty. And they often had, if they were around, they would have a career that was artistic, but without having to run a business, which as an artist, you have to do both. You have to be very entrepreneurial. So I got a little frustrated with many of those messages, and I'm not pointing to those two films specifically, but sort of more on a generalized level. And started to write my own scripts and was encouraged to write my own scripts. And then from there, I dove deeper and deeper into filmmaking as an art and a form of storytelling and as a way of encouraging conversations and having the opportunity to, in some ways, I won't say that necessarily change the world, but encouraging people to really think and change the world as a result.
What drew you to the subject matter of The Last Witch? How did you step into that story?
That story came to me as a surprise, as stories often do. And the origin starts with Sundance in 2020, which was pre-pandemic and a major super spreader event because there were people from around the world who came and we all stood very close to one another. And when you get people from around the world and you're close, you're going to catch something, whether it's a cold or something else. But it turned out that it was the pandemic. But while I was there at Sundance, I was in a restroom late at night after an event, and the faucets were malfunctioning. And as per usual, I crack a joke and I go, "Oh, it's magic. They're coming back on." Just as a woman steps out of a stall going, "Oh, and I'm related to one of the witch hunters from the Salem Witch Trials." So we end up having a conversation that led to my doing a lot of research around the trials, thinking that this could be a great narrative project, taking a different look at them. And what's amazing is that there is so much information available, including the original court transcripts. So I was looking through all of this and following a trail that took me to an article about a middle school teacher and her students who were working to exonerate somebody who was still convicted of witchcraft from the Salem Witch Trials. And there was only one person left that was still convicted. So I thought to myself, because she was still convicted, so Massachusetts in 2021 still had someone from the Salem Witch Trials that was convicted of witchcraft. And so I thought, this is unusual. Now, parenthetical, there are lots of people around the world who are still convicted of witchcraft since the era of the witch hunts. what we look at as the era of the witch hunts, and which stem back to the 1500s through 1800s and into today. I'll put that in there as well. But this court case just seemed to be so unusual because we hear so much about the Salem Witch Trials. And so I thought to myself, because she hadn't been cleared yet, this really might be a documentary as opposed to a narrative film. So where does the story want to take you? So I called the teacher up and I talked to so her name is Carrie LaPierre, and I talked with the then state senator, Diana DiZoglio, who was spearheading the project through the Massachusetts legislature. And I said, are you interested? And they both kind of looked at me and they're like, well, what? A documentary? Sure. And I thought to myself that somebody else must have picked up on this because it's such an unusual story. It's one of a kind, but nobody else had. And so that's really the origin, starting with those conversations and then filming the students and the teacher, and it's just taken off from there. But it's following a moment, following instinct, and then taking action. And that's really the origin of it.
And just to give a little more information on The Last Witch, this teacher of these kids said to the kids, hey, do you want to start researching that? And they went to the cemetery. Is that correct?
It's even bigger than that. So the story itself, just to encapsulate it, it's a story about a middle school teacher and her civic students who worked to exonerate. That means clear the name. You are no longer guilty. But clear the name of Elizabeth Johnson Jr., who was convicted of witchcraft in 1693. She was sentenced to hang. She was day of execution the day before she was supposed to be hanging. So just the day before she was supposed to die, she got a stay of execution, but lived the rest of her life as a convicted witch. And within that, criminal witchcraft. And I promise all my witch friends to call it criminal witchcraft. So this case had been ongoing for many, many years. And then what happened in 2018 is that the Massachusetts legislature got really frustrated because people in general and kids that were growing up and leaving school couldn't tell the difference between fake news and real news. And they decided that there's a need for civics education so that people know how the government works, that this is a real deficit in society, that people don't know how things work and how to participate actively as a citizen. So they unilaterally and across the board voted to implement a civics requirement in the public school system, so that now all students in the 8th grade have to take a civics class with an applied project. So this class came about just as the pandemic took forth. And so the project came out of that they needed a project that was going to be applied, an applied project, so that hands-on, the kids really got to learn how government works. And they needed a project that was going to be manageable just as the pandemic hit, because they were split. So 50-50, kids were working at home or in kids coming to school. So that's really how the project came about. And the rest is history in some ways. But we went to visit them in May of 2022. And that's where we filmed them as they were working in the classroom. They had a visit from Senator DiZoglio. She's now the state auditor, so that's why I'm saying then Senator DiZoglio. And the kids had an opportunity to visit the cemetery, the local cemetery. It's the old burial ground in North Andover, Massachusetts, where people from the era are buried. But what the kids discovered there, and this is really important, is that Elizabeth was not buried there. And the reason why they also discovered and were shocked at is because she was convicted as a witch. And witches could not be buried on hallowed ground. So for the kids to realize that she was not buried with her family was profound. And it changed them. So we followed that transformation with the kids when we went there and have continued to follow them since.
What an incredible story. I'm just so taken by it. Now, you mentioned that you have witches, current witches who are friends. How do they feel about this project and even the history of it? I think that the title witch is an easy moniker to throw on any strong woman who speaks her mind or knows how to heal herself without whatever the modern medicine of the day is.
That's a really good question, and we do bring up the question. So, what is a witch, and how are we using the moniker witch today? So, I'm very careful about using it when people self-identify as witches, as opposed to using it as a label to onto somebody that I don't know how they see themselves. It's very contestable. And it's interesting to talk to the people, various people in this documentary about what is the meaning of a witch, because we talk with historians, we talk with politicians, we talk with obviously the kids and teachers and parents and a lot of people. And we also talk to modern day witches who self-identify as such. And in general, this project has been very well received. They themselves do not consider themselves to be in any way, shape, or form criminal. They consider themselves as healers in many ways, and both for themselves, for other people in society. And like you mentioned, healing in ways that modern medicine may or may not be able to help out with, but also to recognize when modern medicine is the way to go. And of course, in the 1600s, we did not have modern medicine. So, and a lot of diagnoses did not exist then.
But those women and men who identified in that way or had that name thrust upon them were probably well versed in herbs and certain home remedies and things like that, that when you could cure something without throwing a leech on it, that was suspicious. Not to mention the carrot on the nose. I mean, that's a dead giveaway.
Right, the carrot on the nose and the stories that come from that era, many things that we still do today. So I have to keep that in there as well. The way that people looked at what a witch was or was not back then is different from how we look at what a witch is or is not today. Witches have existed, and the idea of a witch have existed since, I don't know, since time began in one way or another. I think it's that ancient. Back in that day, people were looking at witches as somebody that had sold their soul to the devil, pretty much. And those are the ones that are being accused of witchcraft. They are the ones that are being accused of using their soul or their ghost to attack other people in cohort with the devil. So they've given the devil permission to use your soul to hurt and maim other people, even to kill other people. So this back in the day was a criminal offense. It was the worst of the worst that you could possibly imagine. And today you might compare it to a terrorist, more or less. So you can imagine people back then thinking about, I'm walking down the street and there's a terrorist right next to me. I don't know who's a terrorist. It could be my neighbor, could be anybody. But that was the feeling that you didn't know when you were going to be attacked by somebody else's specter or ghost. They didn't have the same kind of medicine that we do today. Their ministers would be, or reverends would be as much somebody that would be a healer and a physical healer as somebody that we today would consider to be a doctor. You would have people that were tailors that would be considered to be healers because they could stitch people up. They knew how to stitch things, things like that that we don't even stop to think about today. They also had a lot of folk magic back then, but nobody would talk about it as folk magic. And then you have the interstice between these two, which there's a blurring of lines when you start to look at it. What I always think about when I look back at what they were doing and using as folk magic back then, we're doing and using a lot of that today. And many of the people that were accused, convicted, and even hanged were using some of the same tools that people use today. For example, astrology, right? Back in the day, they used the almanac And the almanac was based on astrology. So they predicted the weather for an entire year ahead based on the constellations in the heavens. People use astrology today. So those kinds of things, fortune tellers, people, back then, one of the men who hanged Samuel Wardwell was known as a local fortune teller and who often was right. So his predictions would come true. Today, a lot of people go to psychics. It's a booming, burgeoning industry. Many people have crystals at home as talismans of various things, good things, ways to find strength, whatever it is that we experience with items like that. They would have used something similar back then, perhaps. If we're looking at the magic part of it, we're using the same magic as we did then. So where do we draw some of these lines?
We manifest, we build vision boards. The modern medicine of today is a derivative of much plant medicine that's been processed and deconstructed and then reconstructed for profit. We're told dandelions are a weed when in fact they have great healing property. Was she one of the young women who had ergot poisoning? Was she in that group?
Well, ergot poisoning that's a myth.
Oh, it is.
That's been disproven. Yeah, it was not ergot poisoning. There are still questions about what happened and why, but that particular one is really off the table. It's more about mass hysteria. The situation that they were in, they were in the middle of a perfect storm. And so to say that it's just the one thing, I think personally, having studied this quite a bit now, I wouldn't point a finger at the one thing. It was at a time when Massachusetts had been a colony for some time. We're talking about third generation people at this point in some cases, and community of about somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 people. People were traveling back and forth between the US, what is now the United States, so it should be the Massachusetts colony, and England. Not everybody, but there were people who could travel. It would take a couple of months, but there was an exchange of information. It was also a time when the charter for the colony had been revoked, so there were no laws. It was a time when there were a lot of wars going on around them, both with Native Americans. And by then, most of the wars with the Native Americans had filtered out in the area, but they were still going on not too far away. And with that, a lot of people that were there at the time had PTSD from wars, from attacks. It was a time when families were still getting used to a different climate. So at the time, they had very, very cold winters and hot summers. So the temperatures would fluctuate. So let's keep that in mind. So all of those things, and it's still a community at this time, the Puritans were starting to have to revisit their way of thinking, the idea that they came to this area to live a pure life and to live consistently just by the word of the Bible, when there were also other communities coming in. There were quite a few Quakers, for example, in the area. So that was happening. There was a question of economics. Certainly, that's a big one, that there were factions in the communities that were starting to figure out who's in charge and who's in control, who's in power. There are definitely questions about women and women's role, because it was a very patriarchal society at the time. And so there is no surprise that
was.
Yeah, well, exactly. Was. It was. Well, but there are places in this world that are a little bit more matriarchal, and if we can find balance, that would be a good thing.
Yeah.
All of these things coming together really just it's a perfect storm.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And teenagers, am I right?
Oh my gosh, these teenagers. That's actually one of the fun things that I've kept reading about, and I've put into this as well. Teenagers. There was an ordinance in town that was passed, I think, the year before, to say that the kids had to come to church because they had to be quiet because they were getting too rowdy. And I'm looking at some of these stories going, somebody borrowed mom and dad's horse to ride next door to somebody where they were drinking apple cider because the water wasn't that great. So they all made apple cider. So they'd had a little bit too much apple cider. They ride mom and dad's horse back through the forest and something happens. They fall off the horse and voila, stories happen, so there are definitely teenage stories that are part of this as well.
It's just funny to think of 1600s keggers.
Right?
You crashed mom's horse, man.
That's the image. I have to get that image every now and then when I read some of these stories. Kids were kids then, just as kids are kids now, even though their culture was a bit different. And you've got hormones popping and all sorts of things. So,
Oh, yeah. It would be interesting to look at the correlation between how teenagers were behaving in that time and then the witch accusations and then the poltergeist activity around more modern day teenagers and that intense, energetic field, I guess, for lack of a better word, that even science says, yeah, teenagers make so much kinetic energy that it bursts out into a room and knocks over a lamp, which is to me so mind-blowing but fascinating.
For sure. There's so much that we can look at and really learn from this. It strikes me that we haven't learned it, that we've kind of pushed this aside as a fairy tale in many ways. And I think we have a lot to learn. I mean, the teenage thing that you're talking about, I think that's incredibly fascinating because so many teenagers, adolescents were involved in the trials, whether as accusers or as victims or whatever it was. Adding gossip to that, think back to the teenage years and how fragile we all were at that age. I mean, you can't take that out of this story entirely. It's not just about teenagers, but they definitely play a big part.
How many died in the Salem Witch Trials?
How many people were executed? Let's see, I believe it was 21, and don't quote me on it because I don't have those notes right in front of me. Most of them were hanged. One man was pressed to death. But these are the ones that are executed as a direct result. But then there were 5 or 6 people at least that we know of who died in the jails. They had to build the jails because there were no jails at the time. And those were pretty much just thrown together. So a lot of people who lived in poorly constructed buildings, very tightly put together, many of them were wearing chains, iron chains, to keep their specters from flying away and hurting people. And they would be rat infested. There would be disease. You would get the kind of food, the kind of keep that you could afford. So you can imagine the conditions that were there. So we do know that several people died as a result of that incarceration. The execution method that was most commonly used, people think of this as burning witches at the stake and have this image of that being a relatively quick death, or they get the sense that people would be hanged, and we get this image of the news dropping and you're gone. That's not the case. In this case, this was what's known as a short drop, which meant that you dropped just a little bit and you would hang there until you suffocated and died.
They call it the devil's dance because your legs kick around and
yeah. And for a long period of time. I mean, it could take an hour and even longer for somebody to die. So it was painful, a slow, painful death while people were watching you. So you can just imagine, it's absolutely horrific. And that's something that I don't think we recognize enough when we honor these people. It's just pain, the torture they had to go through.
This is the problem with religious fervor. Every time I see any explosion of that, I get incredibly nervous. One minute it's a witch, the next minute it's a trans person or a civil rights leader, or you just go down the line. Those who have been murdered in the name of a religious fever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you're so right. And it's not just about one kind of religion or one denomination. You see that in every religion, every denomination,
It's
right?
humankind. They just use religion as their back. They hide behind the religion, but it's really about what's in people's hearts, I think.
Exactly. What people are afraid of,
Yeah,
what they're afraid of for themselves, and what they're not willing to face about themselves.
I agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. What is the plan with the film?
It's very exciting. We are going to be filming again. We're not done filming. So let me underscore that. We've filmed 3 times so far. We filmed the time that I mentioned back in 2022. Then we went back again in 2023 to revisit with some of the students and the Carrie, the teacher, and with some of the other people that we've already interviewed, historians and politicians. We interviewed now state auditor Diana DiZoglio again to get her perspective a year later. Elizabeth was exonerated in July of 2022. So now we're 2023. So how is this impacting society is really the big question. And we got some early answers to that. It's impacting us, women's rights. It's impacting civic participation. It's impacting on how we view mental health. It's a fairly long list of questions and issues that we can point to: diversity, how we're treating each other, how we're bullying each other. All of those questions are coming up in this. Then we filmed again during Halloween in Salem because that is a big holiday tradition there now. Salem has come 180, 180 degrees, and now celebrates people who identify as witches, people who feel a bit different, can find a home in that community. We're going back again in August to film more. We're going to be filming at the Peabody Essex Museum, and is the intent, where they have a huge exhibit that's opening up on July the 6th about the Salem Witch Trials and a few more things. So meanwhile, I, as the writer director, have been working on taking all of these pieces to create a story so that we have a journey to take people on, not just about the court case, but what does this mean? And what does it mean in terms of claiming your voice? And one of the ways that we're going to be showing that is when we have the film just a little bit further along, we're going to be filming a reenactment of Elizabeth's original court hearing, so that we get to hear her voice and we get to hear her words, and she gets to claim her own voice and help us to listen to what she has to say, what she had to say then, and what she has to say now. Because she, like all of us, does need and deserve to be heard. And it's not until we speak up and we listen to those voices that we can really learn from them and make a difference in our own lives. So that's what's next for making this film become a reality. And then from there, we'll get to distribution so that everybody gets to see it.
Cannot wait.
That's a big part. And of course, we're fundraising. So fundraising like crazy to get this done. So I have to mention that as well. That's the other big part, because it's not just about making a film. A film like this, and to do it well, does cost a lot of money to make. I want this to be the kind of film, like you said at the beginning, that people would want to talk about, want to come and see and go, have you seen it? Have you seen it? Have you seen it? I got to see it, and in order to do that, we have to do a good job, which does require a lot of funds. So a big part of my work right now is raising a lot of money to bring people into this community that's making the film, because it's a community film.
And they can do that through the website.
They can do that through the website. So they can go to our website, sign up for our newsletter, which we give updates on a regular basis. And it's going to be exciting because we're going to be filming. So there'll be a lot of updates. And that will also take you to where you can contribute funds. I always say it's like whether you have $5 or $500,000 to contribute to this, you are part of our community.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's really, really important. Now, those people that do have a little bit more to contribute should reach out to me via the website and let me know, because we'll have a conversation. We have a way for things, for larger contributions to be tax deductible, that we work through fiscal sponsorship, where It's a way for people that do have a little bit more to contribute and participate, to also potentially receive a tax deduction for their contribution. So definitely want to put that out there too.
What is the website?
The website is thelastwitchfilm.com, all in one. And I think you're going to include that in your links as well. So it'll be easy for people to find. Yeah. And from there, sign up and follow us on all social media as well, because we love that. We reach a lot of people who have great conversations about all these topics, and just seeing our community grow and being a part of it.
Absolutely. Does Elizabeth have any descendants? And I'm also curious, has she come to visit you at all?
That's a really good question. Both are good questions. So first of all, Elizabeth does not have any descendants. Elizabeth was not married, no children, and because she was not married, she didn't have a husband to speak for her at the time. And one really important reason for why she got lost in the shuffle in many ways, she did not have any children. She had no descendants to speak on her behalf.
Any siblings?
She did have siblings. Her brother spoke on her behalf a couple of times, but over time, people forgot about her. She disappeared. And that's something that it's very close to my heart as a single woman as well. How easily will I be forgotten? That resonates with me. She was also we know she was a little bit different. She's described as being simplish. Exactly what that means, I'm cautious about diagnosing retroactively. There are people who will suggest that she may have been slow to develop in some way, but exactly what it is, we don't know. We do know I can read the court transcripts and I see that she's very bubbly and she gets attention and she takes that and runs with it. But again, exactly what it means, we can't diagnose. We just know that she was different. So that's a really big aspect to this. And so you had a second part of this question as well.
I'm curious if she's visited you.
This has been a fascinating journey for me as well. She's not come to visit me. She has visited one of the students and visited with that student's ongoing. They had a very close relationship, which we're talking about in the film. She chose one of the students to speak on her behalf during this process, which is very interesting. I also think that Elizabeth, in her own way, has been speaking to other people. And in a sense, she's speaking to all of us because she won't let go. She's finally getting her voice, and she is insisting that we tell the story. She insisted that she be free from this burden of the conviction. She's also insisting that we remember her. So there's a reason for why there's an exhibit on her behalf in this large exhibit that's coming to Salem, Massachusetts at the Peabody Essex Museum. There's a reason why she wants to have a memorial somewhere so that we will remember her and her journey. And I think there's a reason why I'm making this story, and she's probably a part of creating that as well. So I feel like she's just not going to give up until she gets her story told in that sense. But I haven't seen her physically, so I haven't had that.
Oh, it's such an interesting aspect that she has chosen a child to tell her, to talk to. I love that. Oh, I'm so excited to watch this movie. I cannot stand it. Please keep me updated along the way.
Of course.
Let's talk about Sheltering Love, which is an Alzheimer's dementia film, documentary. And then Eddie's Turn is something that is coming up.
Yes, both of those. And they're wonderful projects. Let's start with the documentary, which is Sheltering Love. And that's an ongoing project that's been in the works for a number of years now. It's a story about a daughter who finished graduate school just as her mother developed signs of Alzheimer's, signs that were strong enough. I didn't start to develop them, but had signs of Alzheimer's that said she needed help. So Dawn, who is the protagonist in this story, it's her story. She moved back home to New Jersey from Los Angeles, where she just graduated from the American Film Institute and was poised for a career in Hollywood. had she stayed here. She realized that her mother needed help. And so she moved back home to New Jersey, where she's been taking care of her mother since for over 10 years now, well over a decade, and has found a way to keep making movies from where she's at. But her mother has been progressively getting worse. And so at this point, her mother is non-responsive. Dawn is still taking care of her mother and has been documenting the journey all this while. So the story is in many ways about what that means as a daughter taking care of your mother and how that shapes and changes the relationship. It's also a story about self-discovery in many ways. Dawn, through this journey, has discovered more about her mother's history, for example, and thinking about how that applies to herself. She's discovered more about her mother's history and origin as a Norwegian coming to the United States. And so in the process, Dawn has been learning Norwegian and going back to find her own roots in Norway in a way that she may or may not have done had it not been for this journey. And of course, her mother's name is Love. I can't forget that. So, and that's why it's sort of a double entendre. It's sheltering the love between a mother and a daughter. And it's sheltering Love, the woman who now needs support as she's transitioning with a very difficult, debilitating disease.
And that is an ongoing project that's not out yet either. Yeah.
It's not out yet either. There's still more filming to be done for that as well. So it'll probably be another couple of years before it's actually ready to be seen also. But it's another incredible story, very personal. We're treating it with care because it's a tender, tender story, obviously, but one that so many people can relate to.
Well, what about Eddie's turn?
So before we get into Eddie's term, I just want to say that's www. That's everything, right? So shelteringlovefilm.com.
Shelteringlovefilm.com. And you're the executive producer on it?
I'm a producer on it.
Okay, got it.
Yes. And then we have Eddie's Turn, which is my narrative short film. That's my other project. It's my passion project in many ways. And it's a story about a former ICU nurse. She's burnt out. She has PTSD from her work at the hospital. And she now comes to visit her uncle's ranch, where she finds a friend in a former racehorse that's recently off the track and just lingering about and also needs a new path in life. So through trials and tribulations, the two of them come together to form a partnership, healing and partnership, as potentially becoming equine therapists working together, where there is a clinically trained therapist who works with the assistance of a horse to help human beings heal in different ways. So very much about healing.
I've read a little bit about equine therapy, and I think it does wonders for people. Horses are incredibly intuitive creatures. They're beautiful animals, for sure.
The transformation that happens in work with horses it's second to none. If you've observed it, if you've seen it, if you've experienced it, it's something that I want to bring to light with this story. And that's another reason for why it's so important to me. I started working on it during the pandemic when I went back to horseback riding after many, many years out of the saddle on a regular basis, and met a horse called Eddie, who is the inspiration for this story. It's not my story, but it is an inspiration for the story. And through that, I learned more about equine therapy. And I want to just preface it because there are so many different ways that we can look at this. So equine therapy is therapy by a trained professional, licensed trained professional, working with the help of a horse as an assistant, as opposed to more generalized healing with horses, which can take place in many different ways, everything from leadership coaching to a wellness seminar, all of those things. So there's a spectrum. But in going on this journey, I've had the privilege of visiting so many different places that are working with equine therapy specifically, and seen, for example, just give you one example, and there was a young man at one facility who was autistic, when he came to the facility originally, he was nonverbal. Now, at this point, we saw him take care of a horse, brush a horse, and train to be a trainer of other people who were like him so that they could learn how to brush horses. So a young autistic man that went from not only being nonverbal, but now being a trainer, teaching other people how to take care of horses. He had sponsored his own horse that he had done the math for which horse he was going to sponsor. And the list just goes on and on and on. So to see this ability of the horses to heal, and that's just one example. We've seen so many of them. So the idea of Eddie's turn is to work with nonprofits that are working with equine therapy or wellness, and to work with groups that are working with horses that are coming from the track that need new jobs because they come off the track having been elite athletes. They've had one job, they're ready for the next one, like many of us. And working with those groups as well to bring awareness and support for their activities and maybe help one or two more people gain access to this wonderful opportunity.
I love it. And what's Eddie's Turn's website? Eddie'sTurnMovie.com. And I'll put all the links on Hey Human Podcast. For sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're a delight. I'm so excited for you and for the work you're putting out into the world. That's, I think, is quite healing and beautiful and educational and all the things that we need desperately. And who knows, maybe some people will see The Last Witch and think, we need to put civics back in our schools. I remember civics class. I did not know they had taken it out, but it's not a surprise to me.
Well, that's the hope, too, that we can open up people's eyes to the importance of knowing how to participate, knowing how to discern information, and having conversations. For me, that's a big message for The Last Witch. And all of these, it's a message of healing and care that's underlying all of them. And the possibility that we actually do have as humans to take care of each other just a little bit more. But it starts with conversation for sure.
Absolutely. I wish you all the success and I'm so excited. I cannot wait to see the movie.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. This has been a delightful conversation. I so enjoyed it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And thank you for listening, everybody. Bye. Rate, review, and subscribe to Hey Human Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, all the places that you like your podcast. Thank you for listening. Bye.